Hey, I'm Jason Retailgeek Goldberg. Are you curious how 2021 ended up from a retail sales perspective? Are you having trouble separating the facts from some of the hype? If so, this video is perfect for you. Grab a coffee and let's get into it. So the U.S. Department of Commerce retail sales data is out for December, which now gives us a full look at what 2021 looks like. So I thought I'd break it down for you. And in order to get a good picture of what happened in 2021, it's important to think about what happened before the pandemic. So back in 2019, retail sales were $5.4 trillion. And then in 2020, when the pandemic happened, we saw a significant decline in retail sales in March, but then retail quickly recovered and was actually ahead of 2019 for the rest of 2020. So by the end of 2020, we had sold $5.9 trillion, which was 3% more than we sold in 2019. 3% is about the average growth we see every year in retail. And if you're wondering how we were able to grow in a year that was so impacted by the pandemic, there are two real obvious factors. There was a lot of economic stimulus and extra money that went into the economy that put consumers in a really strong purchasing position. And some of the things that consumers traditionally spent that money on, like travel and gyms and entertainment, were less available to them. So as a result, more of their spending went into the goods that consumers could get from retailers. So that really drove sales despite the unusual circumstances of the pandemic. And then what happened in 2021? Well, retail sales exploded. All of those same factors were still in place, but only in a more exacerbated basis. So people were getting antsy to get out of the house. They were spending more on goods. More of the economic stimulus had kicked in. And so by the end of 2021, we sold $6.6 trillion in retail sales. That's an 18% growth over the previous year. That would be a 22% growth over 2019. And by historic standards, those growth rates are unprecedented. If we think about what 18% growth is like, it's more than twice the normal growth rate we saw any year in retail over the last 30 years. And if we think about what 22% growth looks like over 2 years, it also represents about twice as fast a growth as we would normally get. So by any objective standards, the pandemic was hugely favorable to retail, and retail had the best 2-year period in any of our careers, which is remarkable. But it's dangerous to think about retail as a whole because individual categories in retail experienced the pandemic very differently. So if the whole industry grew 22% over those 2 years, what you really want to think about is the categories that outperform that industry average. So those categories were things like automobiles that sold 24%. They were in high demand, they were difficult to get, so prices were high. Used cars exploded during the pandemic because new cars were so hard to make and get. And so the automotive industry, which is the biggest category of retail spending, actually grew above the industry average. Then you have categories like building materials, all those things consumers were spending on to improve their homes since they weren't traveling as much, all those purchases from Home Depot and Lowe's. And then very near the top you had sporting goods, all those items that consumers bought to stay in shape since they weren't going to a gym as much. But the category at the very top of this chart is non-store sales. That's all the sales that used to happen in a brick and mortar store and are now happening online. So we'll definitely be talking more about that. Now let's look at some of the categories that underperform the industry average. As you would expect, apparel had a tough time during the pandemic. Most of us were spending the pandemic in sweatpants in front of our computers, so we didn't buy as many clothes. We didn't have as many events or occasions to buy new clothes for. And of course, things like gasoline didn't sell well during the pandemic, as most of us weren't driving to work and simply just didn't use as much gas as we would have before the pandemic. It's also interesting to think about how many people were walking into a brick and mortar store in 2021. So this is some data that we get from Placer AI, which use consumers' mobile phones to estimate how many consumers visited retail stores. And as you can see, for the first half of 2021, foot traffic in brick and mortar stores was still down versus 2019. And we started to see foot traffic in the second half of 2021 spike above the pre-pandemic levels. But once Omicron kicked in December, we saw that foot traffic drop dramatically at the end of the year. So for the whole year, 2021 still did not have as many visits to brick and mortar stores as we did in 2019. So when you think about the fact that sales grew 22%, but fewer people visited a store, that really tells you that the main consumer behavior of this pandemic was consumers learning to buy more of their goods online. So let's look at that a little more carefully. The e-commerce sales data from the U.S. Department of Commerce doesn't come out until mid-February. So we won't have a complete picture of the year until mid-February. But looking at the 23 months of data that we do have, it looks like e-commerce spending is going to come in around $950 billion for this year. So if that proves out to be true, that'll represent about 16% of retail. That'll represent 38% growth from 2019. So let's look at e-commerce sales the same way we looked at retail sales. If we go back to 2019, in 2019 we sold about $761 billion online. And then in 2020, the pandemic kicked in and it really accelerated e-commerce growth. So we had healthy growth for the first quarter, and then once March came in and the pandemic became a reality for most American consumers, e-commerce dramatically accelerated. And by the end of 2020, we had sold $924 billion online. That represented about 21% growth, which is a faster than usual growth for e-commerce. And then in 2021, sales continued to stay above those 2020 levels. So one of the things we were all curious about was, would that e-commerce growth be temporary and go back to the stores, or would it stay online forever? And what we can see is we had another 14% of e-commerce growth in 2021, which I think fairly definitively answers that question, that those consumers that learned how to shop online aren't going back to stores like they used to. And so if you look at the 2-year period, this would represent about 38% growth. And so again, if you want to think about retail growth and e-commerce growth on a historical perspective, for the last several years, retail averaged growth of around 3 to 4% a year. Brick and mortar was growing 3 to 4% a year, and e-commerce was growing 10 to 15% a year. So then the pandemic kicked in, and e-commerce had a huge spike. Brick and mortar sales actually shrank, and so we had the biggest gap ever. And by the second quarter of 2021, because e-commerce was comping against those big 2020 numbers and retail was comping against those soft 2020 numbers for brick and mortar, it was actually the first time in my career that retail sales, brick and mortar sales, grew faster than e-commerce sales. And so then, you know, that gap started to right itself in Q3 of 2021. And when we get the Q4 numbers next month, I think what we're going to see is that growth rates are going to normalize back to their pre-pandemic levels. So we're going to see brick and mortar fall back into that 3-4% growth rate, and we're going to see e-commerce kind of level out at between that 10 and 12% growth rate. So that's a quick snapshot of what we saw in 2021. I hope everyone has a great 2022, and until next time, happy commercing.